Good evening. I am thrilled to be here for the second night of Joan Judge's 2026 Rosenbach lectures. Last night's lectures were just wonderful, and I look forward to hearing more on the topic around publishing and common readers. I want to begin by telling people about the future years, so 2027 and 2028 Rosenbachs. Next year, on March 29th to April 1st, 2027, Kate Icahn, who's at the New School in New York, will do a series of lectures on the past, present, and future of finding aids and discoverability and the impact on knowledge and memory. And in 2028, Adam Smythe will speak to us on the form of codex across periods and cultures to ask and answer questions about how the codex works and how its formal qualities like openings, folds, and edges provide a site for meaning. So I look forward to the next couple of years of Rosenbach lectures. It's quite exciting to have them lined up already, so I have to say I'm very pleased about that. And now I just want to welcome our Chinese Studies librarian here in Penn, Anna-Alexandra Fodde-Reguer, and I want to ask her to come up and introduce today's speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is very exciting. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who really does not need an introduction. Am I right? Dr. Joan Judge, a cultural historian and professor in the history department at York University. Dr. Judge was a 2021 recipient of the Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. In her own words, 3 concerns drive her research: the material constitution of ideas, the cross-cultural interpenetration of epistemologies, and the refinement of historical method. Among her many publications is her well-known 2015 monograph entitled Republican Lens, Gender, Visuality, and Experience in the Early Chinese Periodical Press. And her newest book, published by University of Chicago Press, is called The Politics of Common Reading, Vernacular Knowledge, and Everyday Techniques in China, 1894 to 1954, published this year. In today's talk, Dr. Judge will speak on Chinese how-to books and vernacular knowledge. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Judge.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So it is indeed for me a great honor to be among this list of people giving these lectures funded by the great bibliophile and book collector A.S. Rosenbach, funded first in 1928. While his vast interest in literature and children's books and Judaica did not focus on China, it did extend to China. I found that in his museum, which displays the collection that he gathered, it includes a copy of the I Ching from the Song Dynasty from about the 12th century. So that is an interesting connection, and I will make reference to that text in my talk on Thursday. And it is an absolute honor to follow those who have given lectures before, prominently Professor Roger Chartier, who fortunately is with us today. And I also want to express my sincere thanks to Lynne Farrington for her role in making everything run so smoothly in getting this event to happen. Methods for avoiding and treating electric shock. Electricity is most dangerous and most ingenious. It is invisible but enormously powerful. When villagers and children see things move on their own, whether big things like machines, little things like fans, they assume that it's magic or suspect that it's a ghost. They all want to fiddle with it to see how it works. They do not understand that human bodies also possess electricity, and that if a person should accidentally touch a metal object with an electrical current running through it, they would at worst immediately die a violent death, or at best be paralyzed for the rest of their lives. Is this not terrifying? Drawing on my own experience, I outline in the following all tested methods for the treatment of electric shock. You must read these carefully to avoid danger. A compiler by the name of Wang Han shared this information about the power and danger of electricity in the Ocean of Secret Techniques, a work that was first published in 1915 and reprinted through the 20th century. Wang's Ocean was one of thousands, possibly millions, of cheap how-to books that commercial Minjian, or among the people, publishers produced for an audience of common readers in the period I refer to as the Long Republic, 1894 to 1954. These books, including collections of techniques like Wang's, also daily use compendia, medical formularies, advanced a particular brand and register of knowledge. Usable and accessible, this knowledge adhered to a specific set of epistemic virtues: practicality, efficiency, and verifiability. I label this brand of practical, efficient, and verifiable knowledge vernacular knowledge. In my talk today, we will examine how this knowledge was conceptualized, concretized, and actualized. First of all, how I and how editors, authors, and compilers of the time, including Wang Han himself, conceptualized this body of knowledge. Then how Wang Han further concretized this knowledge in elucidating for his readers a series of practical techniques, which I define as intentional material actions designed to meet everyday social needs. And finally, we'll go down to a village to examine how locals might have actualized this knowledge in a moment of crisis. Various scholars have worked with the concept of the vernacular, which combines connotations of idiom, of translatability, and the quotidian. Some hew closer to the linguistic meaning of the term. Others have developed such notions as vernacular bodies, vernacular science, vernacular modernism, and vernacular industrialism to conceptualize the complexities of localized practices and cultural forms. I pair vernacular with knowledge in order to underscore the epistemic dimensions of practice. Vernacular knowledge is, in my definition, the explanatory framework for practical know-how. This vernacular knowledge is more concerned with knowledge how than with knowledge what or knowledge that. It's more concrete than theoretical, more procedural than declarative, more ars than scientia. It guided readers in understanding the uses rather than analyzing the properties of material substances, in treating the symptoms rather than tracing the etiology of disease, in effectively cultivating rather than accurately taxonomizing plants. Despite this abiding concern with how rather than why or what, vernacular knowledge ultimately challenges the very hierarchy that this dichotomy between how and what implies. The Minjian compilers who produced material for Chinese common readers explicitly asserted that they offered people knowledge while emphasizing practicality. They assumed a synergy between mind and hand, which could be characterized as knowledge that works or materialized theory. While practice-based, their compilations did several kinds of conceptual work. They created new categories of vernacular knowledge that made space for technical knowledge that had been marginalized in the classical canon. This technical knowledge had long been considered a secondary level of competence for official service. These were not the kinds of things that officials studied for the examinations. It included treatises on occupations, on transportation, on health, and on everyday techniques. In classic bibliographies, such works were relegated to a heterogeneous category of what were essentially practical and philosophical misfits. The masters and philosophers was the name given to this category. This was a container for all that could not be subsumed under the other three more coherent categories of classics, histories, and belles lettres. In less formal collections and catalogs, these technical works were classified as lesser writings, as xiaoshuo, or as miscellaneous works. In Republican-era Mingjian catalogs, in contrast, these practical treatises were elevated from their lesser status. They were organized under new rubrics which underscored their social utility rather than their intellectual marginality, specifically category of social use or socially useful books. Authors and compilers of these now deemed socially useful works also introduced new concepts intrinsic to vernacular knowledge. Foremost among these was the Japanese neologism common knowledge, 常识. Authors defined common knowledge as distinct from expert knowledge, as the elemental knowledge all ordinary people should have, as knowledge necessary for the efficient conduct of daily life. This common knowledge included techniques for mixing cures, for avoiding disasters, and for transforming matter in useful ways. It did not include the newly important concept of modern science, or 科学. While the term science had become the shibboleth of the era among elite circles in China, a concept with increasing cultural, social, and epistemic authority, it made few significant inroads into the vernacular realm. Mingjian authors who prioritized locally usable know-how resisted the notion of science as immutable mobiles that were valid beyond their place of production and independent of persons and context. In the rare instances when they used the term science, they qualified it as useful everyday science, science that was immediately applicable to, for example, the seasons or the calendar or geography. This general aversion to using the term science does not mean that vernacular books and their readers do not engage in science, however. As the renowned scientists T.H. Huxley, Max Planck, Albert Einstein, and others have noted, science is essentially trained, organized, refined, and accurate common knowledge. Step-by-step instructions in the how-to books that I'm introducing today guided readers in systematically managing the human body and the natural world, in using the substitution method to treat opium addiction, in dosing cholera victims with fluid replenishing salt, and in grafting plants that shared the same genus or family. Neither the compilers nor the consumers of Republican-era Mingjian texts had need to identify these practices as anything more than what they were, however, practical, efficient, and proven techniques for managing daily life. While Mingjian authors and compilers did not use the new term for science, they translated new scientific or biomedical knowledge into practical knowledge that common readers could use. This was one of the three principal forms of translation they undertook in creating usable vernacular knowledge, which I think of as fundamentally a translational space. In addition to translating this new scientific knowledge into practical knowledge, they also translated specialized Chinese knowledge into generalized knowledge that common people could master. And they translated daily life experience into explicit textualized knowledge. As they translated across these diverse epistemes, Mingjian editors reconciled different knowledge systems. Their method was not one of linear translation, as in rendering the classical into the vernacular language. Rather, it was one of excursive assemblage. They juxtaposed or interwove seemingly incommensurable translated elements, foreign methods, past techniques, lived experience, and they melded them into innovative assemblages that instantiated new ways of knowing and remapped ways of doing. Editors of how-to texts explicitly emphasized the inventiveness of their works, which, and I quote here the introduction to one of these texts, smelted old and new in one furnace, combined East and West in one house, and blended our predecessors' effective methods and our country's long-standing customs with new principles and theories. Blending, combining, and smelting, compilers remade bits of knowledge into something else. Greater than the sum of its parts, this conciliated knowledge enabled readers to think various registers of practical knowledge together, to embrace the new without banishing the old, and to smooth the gaps between them. Wang Han's Ocean of Secret Techniques, a quote from which I opened this talk, is an exemplar of this work of epistemic interweaving. The hydraulic metaphor in Wang's title, The Ocean of Secret Techniques, stands in for the vernacular episteme. The renowned historian of Chinese science, Joseph Needham, had been convinced that a smooth river of Chinese science would ultimately naturally flow into the universal sea of modern science. Wang offered in contrast an unruly ocean of secret techniques. The vehicles of modern technoscience, steamships and airplanes, would struggle to navigate and reconnoiter. The undercurrents of Wang's ocean were deep and historical, its shores expansive and porous. What is of paramount importance to our topic of common knowers is that its waters were usable and sustaining for generations of urban and rural, male and female, middlebrow and lowbrow readers. These readers drove the repeated reprinting of the text over the course of the Republic. The constantly updated covers indicate a compilation capable of renewing its appeal to a changing readership across the period and beyond. The Ocean continued to serve as a household handbook well into the People's Republic of China. It was reprinted in Taiwan in 1980 and in mainland China in 1993. The preface to the 1993 edition hails it as a reference for all possible eventualities encountered in daily life. The Ocean met these eventualities with some 1,000 techniques, categorized techniques, concrete actions, as I said before, designed to achieve everyday social ends. While Wang Han's Ocean is an exemplar of the genre of collections of techniques, it is in many ways a singular work. It stands out not only among contemporary collections of techniques, but among all how-to books from all places and times, including early modern Europe, because of his strong narrative presence. How-to manuals are generally anonymous compilations rather than single-authored works. While Wang was certainly less than an author, he did not write all the material in his texts, which he collected from a vast range of sources. He was much more than a mere compiler. He wrote erudite prefaces to each of the compilation's 20 sections. He appended his own personalized commentary to particular techniques, telling the reader if it worked for him or not when he tried it, for example. He shared his own experiments with historically recorded methods, and he conveyed his and his colleagues' experience with new technologies. He had a clearly, if not overtly stated, ideological stance, and a penchant for what I call the politics of accommodation. He repeatedly challenged the simple picture of Western give and Eastern take in the realm of technology. He was not interested in what China should be, according to new global metrics. His focus was on what China could be. What it could be given its past, often overlooked record of ingenuity, and given what it currently was, a place of vast disparities and modest possibilities. His primary objectives in compiling his collection was to maximize these modest possibilities and to help common readers bridge these vast rural, urban, and regional disparities that were newly compounded by the uneven introduction of novel technologies and foreign ideas across China's vast republic. Wang offered his readers not just a collection of techniques, but a collection of secret techniques. This was a subgenre of how-to technical manuals that embraced wondrousness and highlighted the ingeniousness of local historical methods. The secret techniques in Wang's title were clearly not hoarded secrets. They were openly shared in a repeatedly reprinted commercial publication that targeted a broad audience. Instead, the notion of secrets did other kinds of work for the collection. First and foremost, it established Wang Han's authority as a knower and a sharer of secrets, a compiler in command of an ocean of natural, empirical, textual, and technological knowledge. Wang was not of sufficient stature to have left behind a set of collected works or letters, nor was he the subject of any form of biography that might have outlined the sources of his authority. The sparse details we have about his life are largely limited to those that we can glean from the ocean of secret techniques itself. He explained at the end of the section on electricity that he had worked at one of the earliest Chinese industrial initiatives, the Hanyang Iron Works. This was China's first unified steel corporation. It went into operation in China's central Hubei province in May of 1894. Wang provided no details about the precise position he held as one of the 3,000 Chinese employees at the ironworks. It's nonetheless clear that his Hanyang experience, probably in the late 1890s, and his awareness of the 40 foreign technicians who worked for the corporation would have situated him near the cutting edge of industry at the turn of the 20th century. Wang used the knowledge he acquired at the ironworks, together with the insights of various technically savvy acquaintances, as a vantage point from which to guide his intended readership in their safe, everyday use of newly imported technologies. He combined this personalized know-how with the notion of secrets and the promise of historically verified techniques to create an epistemic space for his readers that was both welcoming and intriguing. This quintessential early 20th century vernacular space was capacious but delimited. It encompassed the wondrous and the practical, but explicitly excluded superstition and science. For those who may have turned to Wang's collection of secrets in search of marvels, the ocean did deliver. The 20 sections into which he organized the compilation included a section on fantastical techniques and another on games and tricks. The entries in these sections were more preternatural than supernatural, however. They describe startling phenomena hidden in the things of nature rather than uncanny forces beyond nature. They presented the natural world as malleable rather than fixed and encouraged readers to experiment and uncover its hidden possibilities. They included techniques for making cats act like dogs, for making oval duck eggs square, and for making white hair turn black. They provided methods for staying awake for 100 nights, for seeing ghosts during the day, and for lighting lamps without oil. At the same time, Wang expressed emphatic disdain for superstition at several points in the ocean. He declared absurd and ineffective a Song Dynasty method for protecting books and calligraphy that required reciting the name of a god of books. He recorded a chant for women in childbirth, not because he believed it was effective, but because it would reduce the birth mother's anxiety. He was even more dismissive of abstract scientific theorizing. His purpose, he stated, was not to parse arcane controversies, such as whether woodlice evolved from tadpoles or potter wasps adopted snout moths as their own larvae. These were topics for academics to explore. Wang was equally dismissive of the potential for the industrial application of science, despite, or perhaps because of, his firsthand experience at the ironworks. He did not harbor any expectation that imported scientific discoveries would definitively, uniformly, or positively alter the lives of his readers. He did not celebrate the virtues of the latest foreign imports. Rather, he was more inclined to underscore their dangers, whether chemicals that could destroy plants and erode eyeballs, or electricity that could kill. He did not once use the term for science, which had been introduced into Chinese elite discourse close to 2 decades before he first compiled The Ocean. While he most certainly would have been aware of the term, he also would have known that it would not have had much purchase for those members of his audience who he sought to address. He made but one reference to an earlier coinage when he described a contemporary who had introduced him to a technique for avoiding electric shocks in a room as a natural history expert, and this was one of the precursors to the modern term Klischwet. He derived the vast majority of the 1,000 techniques that he shared in The Ocean from historical Chinese texts. Most of the over 200 works he cited were from these practical treatises that I called misfits from the masters and philosophers, this heterogeneous category of practical works. From this corpus, Wang collected, selected, sorted, and assembled prior examples of cunning intelligence and artisanal skill as an impetus to resourcefulness in his own day. He took several examples of this cunning from Zheng Hua's treatise on the broad learning of things, a work that was a model of the eclecticism found in his own work, The Ocean. The treatise, which dates, as we can see, from a much earlier period, from about the 3rd century, incorporated knowledge from the empirical and the imaginative, the natural, the supernatural, and the supranatural realms. It analyzed natural phenomena like thunder, it addressed everyday subjects like salt brines, and it described various forms of material inventiveness. One of these inventive accounts, which Wang repeated in The Ocean, featured a crafty peasant who was also a master woodcarver. His skill was so great that he was able to sculpt pieces of wood to look like wheat grains. He then submitted these wooden grains as his land tax. Officials did not realize what he had done until they attempted to put the grains into a grindstone. He gave detailed descriptions from later examples of ingenuity as well, one developed by a certain Wang Ju of the 11th century. Making the device that Wang had developed, a device for reading at night, required using several different kinds of material. It first required carving a box out of rock crystal, filling the box with mercury, sealing it, and tying it with the sealed side against the forehead. We could think of this as an early form of wearable tech. This invention would illuminate the characters on the page as clearly as in daylight. Wang Han also uncovered historical techniques that would serve in the place of expensive and thus inaccessible foreign innovations. He proposed a method he had discovered in the writing of a 16th century monk that would replace Japanese copying machines. It involved using juice extracted from the fruit of Siberian cockabur as a duplicating solution. The juice would yield twice the results with less expense. Wang maximized the audience his secrets would reach by attending to its diversity. He recognized that members of his projected commoner readership had varying levels of literacy, came from diverse social and economic strata, and lived in more and less remote parts of the country. The pricing of the book made it potentially accessible to the full breadth of common readers. The original set price of the book, 1 yuan or $1.20, rose to $1.60 by the 1930s, making it only affordable for the wealthier of common readers, relatively established low-level merchants, office workers, and teachers. But few would have had to pay the full price. The Ocean was discounted by 30% in the mid-1920s, and it was published in the form of a cheap 10-cent edition in the early 1930s. This 10-cent edition would have cost as little as 16 cents, 1/10 the fixed price, within the budget of factory workers and apprentices. Readers who would have purchased a cheap 10-cent or a more pristine dollar edition of The Ocean inhabited often distinct, if overlapping, epistemic communities. Members of these diverse communities had different degrees of experience and understanding of the new, and they had varied proportions of superstitious belief, common sense, and scientific knowledge that informed their approaches to the old. Not all people existed in the same now. Wang's awareness of these differences is manifest in the language and the content of his compilation. He composed the ocean in 2 different linguistic registers. He opened each of the 20 sections in the compilation with learned prefaces redolent with classical allusions. He then composed the how-to entries that followed in more prosaic and straightforward classical language. He often explicitly addressed multiple audiences. He claimed that the medical recipes he provided would both deepen the therapeutic knowledge of city residents and help those in the countryside who had no access to doctors. He relayed techniques for maintaining and repairing clothing that would benefit those, he said, who lived both in larger towns and smaller and more remote villages. He offered both painless methods for binding young girls' feet, these he reproduced from earlier texts, and instructions on releasing the bound foot, which was something that was very new at the time when he first compiled the book in 1915, but something that was not yet happening deep in the hinterland, where unbinding feet did not happen possibly until as late as the late 1940s. He addressed discrete demographics in different sections of the compilation. He was most concerned, however, with reaching lowly to middling common readers in need of fundamental practice-based techniques. He offered these readers information on building procedures, preparing food and drink, repairing implements and personal grooming, whether caring for shoes, cotton and silk, or women's adornments. He provided substantial sections related to household health, emergency measures, accident prevention, bodily treatments, women's well-being, and pediatrics. Wang used a plethora of terms to refer to this commoner audience. Some of them are on the screen, and repeatedly underscored that they were his principal concern. He made this salient in his discussion of medicine. He stated he only included easy-to-make home-style recipes because he understood the information in medical books was often so obscure that it was inaccessible to the common people. He feared that if prescriptions were too difficult and or too expensive, the poor would give up on finding a cure at all. He repeatedly asserted that those living in such isolated areas would find his techniques usable. The forms of disaster relief he proposed and his section on emergency treatment would apply even in outlying villages. He provided commoners who lacked access to or could not afford the new commodities that were flooding in many ways the urban Chinese market with countless techniques for repurposing and maintaining the old, for gluing broken porcelain, for repairing bowls, for ensuring that pottery cups never shattered. He recorded methods for maximizing the use of available materials, from worn clothing to tin implements. And for those who did begin to have access to new commodities, he naturalized their use. He guided his readers in working with and understanding novel materials and imported things, whether foreign ink, kerosene lamps, or leather shoes. He also offered countless methods for efficiently transforming natural usable goods, herbs into remedies, fresh vegetables into preserved vegetables, raw turtle shells into medicine for expediting childbirth. Finally, he provided countless techniques for managing and averting personal disaster, for avoiding accidents and responding to emergencies, whether pediatric illness, breech birth, or the topic we turn to now, electrocution. In offering this array of techniques to address a myriad of challenges, The Ocean, like all how-to books, straddled the realms of reading and making, narrated techniques and daily practices, textual instruction, and social efficacy. It offered readers knowledge to actualize rather than knowledge to contemplate. But who were these active, text-oriented readers? What circumstances led them to Wang's text? And what outcomes did Wang's text afford them? How can those of us who are students not just of the discursive content of books, but of the historical lives of books, approach these questions? Because the historical users of Wang's text, like all common readers, have left at best scant records of their practices of reading and making, it is incumbent on us to devise methods to bridge the gap between the techniques that Wang shared and the Republican readers who implemented them. My approach is to use an assemblage of methods to create composites of who these readers potentially were. I first identify a salient problem that might have plagued a common reader, a problem that was addressed at length in how-to texts and or addressed repeatedly across different genres of texts. I then use various primary sources from archival documents, contemporary treatises, Fodde-Reguer newspapers, journal reports, and fiction to flesh out the specific circumstances that might have led a particular historical individual to seek a way of managing this particular problem with the pages of a book such as Wang's. And finally, I follow scholars of other parts of the world who appeal to arguments of common sense in recreating the past experience of untraceable common readers. I ultimately blend three elements in creating a reader composite. The first is authentic names and actual locations of historical individuals. The second is the details of once urgent problems. And the third is a deeply contextualized common sense, combined with an imaginative engagement with this culturally manifold moment, its richly heterogeneous sources, and its gallery of elusive individuals. Here I introduce the carpenter Li-Swa. I based this story on one of several tales of electrocution that appeared in a 1956 book on common knowledge to prevent electrocution, together with a range of primary and secondary sources, including the Ocean of Secret Techniques. Li's workshop had been one of the first places to use electricity in Anjian, an urbanizing agricultural village in the north of prosperous Wuxi County in Jiangsu Province. Li was therefore the one his alarmed neighbors called on when a damaged lamp cord started to smolder in their home. Without turning off the power switch, Li took out his pliers and attempted to rejoin the frayed part of the cord. Much to his neighbor's horror, the moment his pliers touched the wire, he fell to the ground in electric shock. Still conscious, Li instructed the neighbor to get his nephew, who would know what to do. The nephew finally arrived with a shovel and pickaxe. He started to dig up yellow earth and place it on his uncle's body to draw out the electricity. Another neighbor castigated Li's nephew as Li-Swa lost consciousness. He insisted that the only effective method to use in the case of electrocution was artificial respiration. Alerted to the incident, the village headman consulted his copy of the Ocean of Secret Techniques. When Anjian had gradually started to be electrified in the late 1930s, he had read the entry on several methods for avoiding and treating electric shocks. And this was one of the longest and the most detailed entries in the entire ocean. It was clearly an issue that Wang understood required close attention. The headman had been impressed by Wang Han's authority on this matter as a former employee of the Hanyang Iron Works. The Hankou-Wuhan region, where Wang had lived and worked, had been one of the few inland areas to be electrified at the turn of the 20th century. While electric lighting had been introduced in the coastal areas and the major centers, the major cities of China as early as 1978, as late as 1933, only 5.5% of the national population had access to electrical light and power. So 1933, 5.3% of the population. Anjian, which was situated, as I said, in a well-developed region, the Wuxi region, was exceptional. There are specific reasons it was electrified that I won't go into here. It would not be until the 1970s that electricity would reach smaller villages, including those that were within a 124-mile radius of the capital of Beijing. So this was a new and rare technology in extra-urban areas in the 1940s. And this is when our story unfolds. The village headman further appreciated that Wang Han targeted the needs of ordinary first-time users of rudimentary electricity. Wang explicitly stated that he would not chatter on about electric machines because ordinary people did not use them. The information in the ocean was markedly different from the information in publications produced by mainstream and official publishers, including a primer on the use of electricity published in the early 1930s. The primer exclusively engaged urban, quasi-cosmopolitan elite, as reflected in this unfortunately poorly reproduced frontispiece text. And what we can barely make out is a fashionably dressed woman. Woman would not have dressed like this in the village of Anjan. She is ironing, and her daughter is playing with a little electric heater. And they have a modern-looking lamp hanging above them. The primer discussed the voltages used in foreign concessions of Shanghai and advertised Edison light bulbs, which residents of Anjan, again, would not have used. They would have used locally Chinese-produced light bulbs, which were produced from the 1920s. It wasn't until the early 1930s that the nationalist government publicly urged the dissemination of mass education on electricity. More than 15 years earlier, in 1915, Wang Han had already addressed the need for ordinary people to better understand this technology, a technology that would continue to evoke both fear and curiosity for decades. Frightening stories about the miraculous new phenomena would have reached villages like Anjan well before power lines and light bulbs. Anjan residents might have heard of workers who were electrocuted while installing electric lines or repairing long-distance telephone wires. They would have found reported incidents that occurred in the home even more disconcerting. Wang Han's prime concern, however, was not that his readers would be too terrified to use electricity. His worry was that they would be so beguiled by its wonders that they would use it irresponsibly and expose themselves to danger. The term he used most repeatedly in the 6 subsections of his entry, this very long entry on electricity, was fiddling, fu nong. The temptation to show off newly installed electric lights or to carelessly experiment with the components of various electric commodities would, he warned, result in bodily harm or death. He focused on 2 series of techniques, those related to maintaining safety in an electrically wired household, which Liswa had clearly not read, and those necessary to treat an electric shock victim, which the Anjan village head would rely on. Wang's theorizing on certain aspects of electricity, such as in the opening quote, you might remember he said that it was also intrinsic to human bodies. His theorizing might not have been 100% accurate, but theorizing was not the point. Practical instruction in the safe use of electricity was. For those who had not learned not to fiddle, Wang included 2 techniques for treating an electric shock victim. The first is the one that Liswa's nephew had attempted, spreading yellow sand on the body, a technique that is still used in some parts of the world, including Southeast Asia today. The second method involved first moving the victim away from the electric current, loosening his clothing, putting a cold cloth on his head, and washing his face with cold water. If he remained unresponsive, it would be necessary to use artificial respiration. This had become the global resuscitation method of choice in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as high-voltage electric shocks were increasingly widespread. The neighbor who had been critical of the yellow sand method started to perform artificial respiration, taking all the precautions the village headman relayed from Wang Han's text. He repeatedly used his cloth-wrapped hands to grasp Liswa's wrists, crossed them, pressed them down over his chest, lifted them, and pressed them down again. So slightly different from the illustration, which is not from Wang's text. Unfortunately, his text is not illustrated, but I wanted to give one example of a Chinese text that was introducing this method. Gradually, Li started to breathe on his own. Crisis averted. At the height of the Cultural Revolution in the late 1960s, Red Guards raided the home of Shenhua Ai, a middle school teacher from Liaoyang in China's south-central Hunan province. Because the books in Shen's household had already been purged in 1958 when he was labeled a rightist, all that remained were some lesson books, textbooks, and practice books, a few volumes of the painting manual of the Mustard Seed Garden, a few issues of the Eastern Pictorial, and a copy of Wang Han's Ocean of Secret Techniques. Convinced the character for secret in Wang's title connoted some form of nefarious knowledge, the Red Guards confiscated the book. Shen reflected on their misconstrual of the book's contents in his memoir. Rather than a cryptic and dangerous work, he wrote, the ocean was merely a collection of ingenious methods common people used, and he used the term minjian, to fix things, to make things, and to treat illnesses. This incident highlights the enormous gulf that separates absolutist ideologies from quotidian realities. It conjures the absurd spectacle of the people destroying the people's knowledge. It also reveals that Republican Minjian editions continued to circulate and be used well beyond the Republican period. It raises questions about the afterlife of the vernacular knowledge proffered in such texts as the Ocean of Secret Techniques in the Mao and the post-Mao eras. And it provides a window onto the ways politics, vernacular knowledge, and common reading collided in China's century of revolution. A little over 2 decades after the Red Guards confiscated Shen's book, he could have replaced it with a newly reprinted version of the Ocean of Secret Techniques. This reprint was published in 1993. I introduced it briefly at the beginning of this talk, and it was reprinted in the midst of a reprint fever that was one component of what became known as China's turn of the 20th century Republican fever. And this was a broad-based cultural movement that I like to think of as maybe the last installment in what I think of as the Long Republic. Republican fever was the antithesis of the anti-bourgeois ideological fervor of the Cultural Revolution, which had driven the Red Guards to confiscate Shen's book. It arose in the post-Mao, pre-Xi Jinping era, so this very critical window, a period of tentative political institutionalization, relative economic openness, and scientific professionalization. The fever celebrated the Republic, the period that we've been in today, the period when Wang Han was writing and his book was reproduced, as a period of vibrancy, openness, pluralism, and most importantly, unrealized potential. This enthusiasm for the moment before the communists took power proved threatening to the core tenets of Xi Jinping's regime, which was installed in 2012. These core tenets being unilateral party rule and unification of thought. This emphasis on the wonders of the Republic eroded the party's claim to be the only force that could have saved China in 1949. It was rapidly condemned as historical nihilism, part of a dangerous false ideological trend that undermined the Chinese Communist Party's historical purpose in the guise of reassessing history. In attempting to silence any discussion of what was lost when the Republic collapsed, Xi's government not only mounted a monumental struggle over the correct political line, it also launched an assault on the approach to history that underlay Wang Han's vernacular episteme. Wang viewed the past as a resource rather than a threat. He embraced rather than elided historical contradictions and disjunctions. He made the sediments of time visible and the stark non-synchronicities that always accompany rapid historical change palpable. On the most concrete level, he offered his readers instructions in repurposing the old, naturalizing the new, and demystifying increasingly prevalent imported technologies. The currents of techniques that he either reproduced and revised or tested and mastered did not stream steadily or directly into a sea of modern technoscience, towards which the current Xi regime trends. Rather, they flowed around it, adjacent to it, and sometimes through it in the vast ocean of knowing. Thank you.
Before we start with questions, I just want to mention that we will have an informal seminar tomorrow in the Lee Library from 10 o'clock. Please come and join us, and we'll talk about some of these kinds of things and maybe some other things as well at that seminar. Questions?
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate the effort to get the autobiographical details about Wang Han from the text he includes. I was curious if you saw any pattern in the things where he has personal commentary. So where he talks about efficacy or the application that he himself has experienced in these solutions or approaches. Are there certain things he tries more often than others? Are there kind of patterns in
Yeah, good question. I think I counted there were 16 times when he, said, I tried it and it worked or it didn't work. One had to do with something that would lessen the strength of wind. And it was a Ming Dynasty technique, and it was some sort of, it sounded like sort of a banner-like thing that one could put up to protect oneself from raging winds. That was one. Another one had to do with mixing ink. So there were several traditional Chinese ways of making ink by, combining certain minerals. And he talked again about a Ming Dynasty technique that he had tried. And another one had to do with a pediatric cure. He seemed to have a tremendous emphasis on pediatric illness, which, I don't know if he had a child that died so those are a few of the examples that I remember. So a real range of things.
Thank you so much. I have actually just a question for clarification, a small comment, and then a bigger question. So I'll just start with one of them first. The social. I was wondering about that category of socially usable knowledge, and then social. I mean, there was a couple characters there. That I just need to know, like, if there's something significant about the two things that you were bringing up. And I can't read the characters, obviously, so I'm wondering what's distinct about those two terms.
Right. So, what I'm trying to say is that whereas in the past, these works would have been categorized in bibliographies under, either under that what I call, under the category of misfits, these misfits. So it was sort of a marginal category. These were the iconic categories: classics, histories, belles lettres. And if they weren't in the official bibliographies, they would have been called miscellaneous works or minor works. Mm-hmm. But here we have, and this comes out of the book catalogs for the Minjian publishers. So the publisher who are producing, these how-to books and all of this vernacular knowledge that, I spoke about yesterday and today. So when they were categorizing these works in their book catalogs, they deemed them, books for social use. So instead of saying they're secondary, they're miscellaneous, they're not the things the officials really need, they're saying these are important socially useful.
So there's no qualitative distinction between these two. These are just different ways of expressing the same thing.
Yeah, okay. So this is, definitely. It's just, right. The first one basically says, socially useful category, and the other one says socially useful books.
Okay, sorry. I was just confused whether you're making some other point about the two different categories.
No, they're just two different ways that different.
So the kind of more probing question that I kind of was thinking about is very interesting that the just the when you talk about Wang, the excursive assemblage kind of mediation of the vernacular, it occurred to me that there was something interesting about the fact that there is a kind of, I'm wondering if the tension is between the vernacular and the classical in some of what you said, as opposed and not really. I mean, the tension is not the vernacular classical, but more a certain type of vernacular and a kind of vernacular classical. And I'll try to give an idea of what I mean. I get the sense that there isn't I mean, just in part of it is in the terminology, even labeling these things, like, you know, using the classical terms of like secrets, like in the text, which of course saved Shenhui's texts from being taken away, because it kind of still had some kind of sort of suggestion there, but yet I was just curious about if there was some kind of mediation of the classical into the vernacular that kind of maintained a kind of some of the classical element, and yet it was before it got to the vernacular. I mean, I'm trying to figure out what that mediation process was in between, and also whether, when, you know, against superstition, etc., it's not against really the classical there ideas, but really a kind of a sort of impure vernacular that is really being fought, you know, kind of reshaped in the new vernacular, in the modern vernacular. So I was wondering if those nuances hold.
Yeah, it's obviously very complicated, all of the different registers of knowledge. In many ways, you know, it does sort of sit in between folk, which, you know, Wang Han himself would disparage as sort of, you know, superstition, and, you know, what he claimed was too academic and arcane. But, you know, what he's doing versus what others who are declaring themselves vernacularists in this period is very different, in that, you know, what I think you're sort of saying, yes, they are taking treatises from the past and making them more accessible. They're not saying we have to get rid of that knowledge altogether, but they're saying we're going to take the most useful elements and integrate that with other things in order to produce something that, you know, these intentional, you know, that will serve the needs of people today. So it's not like they're banishing the classical vernacular. Isn't at all, you know, a complete repudiation of all kinds of formal learning, but it is a means of, you know, just trying to make it more pragmatic and usable, and very, very distinct from this move of, you know, the elites undertook around 1919, 1920, when they were supposedly creating a vernacular. They very self-consciously said, get rid of Confucius, kill the classics, get rid of all of that. That's what's strangling China. Adopt everything from the outside world. They even, you know, completely bastardized the language by taking in European grammar and tried to create a new, you know, a new sort of way of expression that was more foreign to the common people than these sort of toned down versions of classical texts in the past. So yes, it's very, very complex trying to think about these different registers of knowledge and trying to sort of map out, you know, where this sits. But I think if we think of it as an excursive assemblage that takes in a lot of things and don't try to too tightly define it, it helps us get a sense of, you know, Wang Han was clearly, you know, very learned in some ways, but also very attuned to things coming into China, and it all came into the mix. I hope that answered a little bit.
I have a question, and it ties in with what Devin was saying, because I'm kind of curious about, like, the place of, I mean, with something like electricity and shock, that is a kind of new knowledge that has to develop, and how that's developing. I mean, we think of, you know, there are folk ways where people figure out things along the way as things change over time, or as they're trying to figure out, you know, even things like opium addiction or something like that. But with new technologies, as they come in, they create new issues that then need to be dealt with. And so the question is, how does that knowledge develop? you know, I mean, so that we know we need to do X, Y. I mean, is that coming in from outside to some extent, from the West, along with electricity, or is it something that people are figuring out as they go along? And sort of thinking about the newer modes and how they also affect knowledge.
Yeah, so that is, precisely what Wang Han is trying to do. And because he had that experience at the ironworks, he had close proximity to electricity, which was used there. So one of the avenues is people who are sort of, in that technical, and I think it would be fascinating if we knew more about the people, not the people who ran the arsenals and the new factories, et cetera, but those who worked there as sort of tradespeople and what they learned in terms of technologies. So I think that's one way it came in, just from people who were, working in these new industries. A lot of it came in from Japan, which had industrialized first. Many, many Chinese educated in Japan, saw things, first being introduced there, translated whatever how-to books the Japanese had created for themselves. So several different ways that they, came to terms with these new technologies. And there was a tremendous amount in the press, in the newspapers. And often, in these how-to books, I would find that, introductions to certain cures or certain techniques came, were sort of vernacularized, but came out of a newspaper report on this new technology and how do we deal with it.
So they would be talking about new ideas coming out, and then those new ideas would make their way into these, from the newspaper into these how-to books and things like that. I was trying to trace, think about tracing that movement. How do things get into these things, and thinking about newspapers is an interesting thing, because presumably it's pulling information from somewhere as well. And where is that they're getting their information from?
Yeah, so definitely the press, external sources, and local experts. I think we're all sort of, mediators of these new technologies. Yeah.
Can I come back? Oh, no, we have a question. You can ask first.
Professor, Professor, I think you went too quick on presidency, what you call historical nihilism. What kind of harm does the common knowledge, the common encyclopedia, pose on his project?
Yeah, that's a good question. If it's common knowledge that came from the earlier period, that means that there was sanctioned knowledge in the period before the communists declared what was necessary and important knowledge. There's a fabulous quote that I have at the end of my book that comes from the woman writer Fang Fang, who wrote during the Wuhan. Wuhan was the first place to be closed during COVID. And she kept a diary, was later vilified because she was quite critical of the way China dealt with it. But she has a fabulous quote where she says, the government sticks to political formulas and it doesn't use common sense. And I really see that as, these were people on the ground and they sort of knew what they needed to do. Whereas you've got this overlay of ideology that tells you, you've got the character's secret in a book. It's got to be, some kind of black element, or the COVID restrictions were attuned to some sort of, political plan and not really to the reality of what people were living. And she said that very poignantly, and juxtaposed political formulas and just the common sense of how we should be dealing with these issues. So it's not like Xi Jinping has stood up and said, down with vernacular knowledge, but the fact that, much of this knowledge came from an earlier period, which he, has to vilify because that, undermines his own project. And also the fact that as much as the Communist Party is supposed to be listening to the mass line, it's also telling the masses what the line should be. So.
Sorry. So my question is kind of coming from a comparative thing. I'm wondering, is there a distinction in the classical language between socially usable knowledge and the knowledge one must, like the other genres which are more linked with classical knowledge? I ask only because in India there is such a distinction, and it sort of smacked me in the face in the late 90s when I was studying a Sanskrit text in rural India with a teacher, a pundit, and he basically asked me quietly in between one of our sessions.
He asked you what, sorry?
Well, he asked me, "Is there such a thing as hotel management?" And I asked him why. Like, why do you ask? He's like, well, his grandson was studying that, and then he explained to me that there's a distinction in sort of the knowledge systems in the classical between varta and vidya. Vidya is this kind of knowledge you have to go to school to learn. It's classical knowledge. It's like it requires, training. Varta is the kind of knowledge you just go work in a particular place and you pick up usable knowledge. So that distinction is already in that kind of classical sense of how they divide up types of knowledge. So I'm wondering, is there such a thing in the Chinese case of having already that distinction early on?
Yeah, I don't think there's a different language, but there were definitely different texts that conveyed. Like there were texts that were called zazi. They were like just teaching characters, simply teaching characters. And you see in the prefaces to those texts saying, we don't need all the Confucian overlay and all the stuff about ethics and ritual. We need to know how to do X, Y, and Z, whether it's planting crops. So we're going to introduce a terminology that is, pertinent. So it's not like it was a whole different register of knowledge, but it was, I guess, a different vocabulary. And it's messy because even these early treatises, like the one that I said Wang Han drew on to, the peasant who made the wooden grains, that's an early text. It's, focus is on practical matters, but it's written in very, very classical prose. So even though that wouldn't have been a text that the scholars would have studied in order to pass the exams, they might have studied it once they were officials and they were trying to manage things in their local area. So it wasn't a completely different language. So there were different vocabularies and sort of, different textual ways of getting it more practical versus the classical language, but not two separate languages as far as I understand it. Interesting.
Could you say more or try to hypothesize more about the moving between the different registers in the oceans where the prefaces are slightly more elevated, or you can correct me if I'm using the wrong terms, versus the meat of the book in terms of what that says about the author's imagining of different readers or how they would be approaching it?
Yeah, I think he was trying on the one hand to, establish his bona fides with other elites by, I can, drop names for, all these different texts. I'm not just, giving you sort of practical advice. And then, but, at least according to his own words, he was very concerned with actually conveying techniques that were, repeatable, practical. So and it's really marked, and it's not unique to this text. It's actually, yes, it's something that you find in, many of these. Craig Clunas has talked about this in terms of compendia that were, sort of commonplace books that were, combinations of earlier writings. Quite often they would be introduced in a very erudite way, but then the meat of what was being conveyed in those works would be presented in more, vernacular language. So it isn't something unique to Wang Han by any stretch.
Is everybody a common knower to some extent?
Yes, but some, people know different things, right?
I'm thinking that there is common knowledge that we all need in dealing with our daily lives, even if we're an official, even if we are highly educated, even, I'm just trying to think about that, thinking about people, everybody in a sense needs some of these things, whether they're reading certain things. I wouldn't be surprised if there were people, who were And different stratas and the higher stratas also reading similar kinds of things.
Yes,
That's all
and
I was,
you know,
yeah.
even this person who I introduced in the conclusion, Shambois, I mean, he was somebody who read books for a living. He was a teacher, but he used the Mishuhai. You know, what I'm trying to get at by talking about common knowers is to think about this demographic as knowers, because we have tended not to think of them as knowers, and to think of the kind of knowledge they have not as knowledge, but they just did stuff. It was just but that there was a certain amount of conceptualizing and understanding, and so that's where I'm going with the common knowers. You're right. I mean, we all need to know how to glue things together or fix things, or some better than others, but I think that we all need a certain amount of practical knowledge. But what I'm trying to say is that this demographic did know things. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about whether Wang inserts himself when he's discussing things like foot binding or women's health or even childhood illnesses? I understand that he's providing a little bit of information about himself, but is there anything maybe a little bit more political about, or it could be interpreted as such, about what he writes?
What I found political was his real disparagement of the new things coming in, and sort of repeatedly saying we're being flooded with this stuff. And he's trying to say to his audience, innovation doesn't have to come from the outside world. Look at what Zhang Hua did back in the 3rd century. Look what Wang Ju did in the 12th century. So what he's trying to do is say, we ourselves we have a resourceful culture. We have the ability to think these things ourselves. So it was a real effort not to cave and say, let's just learn from the West and embrace it and abandon everything that we have. It was a totally different approach to meeting that challenge of the West. And it wasn't like he wasn't aware of it, and it wasn't like he was, absolutely condemning what came from the outside, but he talked about the dangers. Okay, there's chemical fertilizers, but those kill plants. Okay, there's this new kind of ink, but it corrodes your eyeballs, was something he talked about. So it was just a very nuanced approach to what came in, and I would say that is an ideology in itself. And he certainly didn't come out and declare it that way. That wasn't why he wrote this book, but it's very implicit in the way he was trying to say, we have valid resources, epistemic resources here, and everything that comes in from out there is not necessarily golden.
Any other questions?
There must be.
What?
Anything online?
No, there wasn't anything online. So I checked again. Well, I'd like all of us to thank Joan Judd for another wonderful talk today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.